Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at how the United States goes about gaining representative government. We've touched on a couple of these things in the previous lessons, but we're going to go into a little more detail and talk about representative government and how it sort of gets its start in colonial America. So, with that being said, let's sort of dive right into this and let's talk a little bit about what Indicator 1.2 is about. And I've got it listed on here. Analyze the early development of representative government and political rights in the American colonies, including the influence of the British political system and the rule of law as written in the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, and the conflict between the colonial legislatures and the British Parliament over the right to tax that resulted in the American Revolutionary War. So that is what Indicator 1.2 is about. So we're going to try to address all of those things in this presentation. Before we start diving into this, we've got a set of learning objectives that we really want to try to accomplish. So by the end of listening to this presentation, you should be able to answer these questions. If you want to write them down now at the end of your note sheet, you can, or you can wait to the end and then write them down. But here are the main learning objectives. The first one: what early documents influenced representative government in colonial America? Second one: describe some examples of early representative government in colonial America. The third one: explain the events in England that caused the formation of representative government. The fourth one: describe John Locke's importance in helping form a representative government. The next one: explain salutary neglect and its role in the starting of the American Revolution. The next one is explain how the French and Indian War led to the ending of salutary neglect. The one after that is describe the British Acts and the reactions to trying to regain money lost to financing the French and Indian War. And the last one: explain the feelings of the colonists to all the taxes being imposed on them. What was their main argument? Is what you're going to answer for that one. So again, if you want to write these down right now, you can pause the video, go to the end of your sheet and go ahead and write those down. Make sure that you answer these questions and you have them written down on your note sheet. So let's look at some of these early documents. Of course, the first one we're going to talk about is the Magna Carta. And this document is actually signed around 1215. And its importance was a couple of things. Number one, it sort of started limited government and tried to limit the power of the king, because the king had been sort of abusing his power to tax. It also gave a trial by jury, that was the first time that had ever been done. So this was done in early England around 1215 by King John. But it is, again, a big document that is very important to not only the British government, but also to American government as well. The other document that you guys need to know that comes from Britain is going to be the English Bill of Rights. And what the English Bill of Rights did, it was signed in 1689. It created a constitutional monarchy where the king or queen had to answer to a constitution that was written by the British government. And it limited the power of the king. Moving on to the next. We've got some examples of representative government in the new colonies. And we've talked about a few of these. The first one was the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was not necessarily democratic because only property owners could vote. So, and remember, the House of Burgesses was in Virginia. So you had to own land in order to be able to vote. So not everybody was really voting. The other example of representative government in early colonial America was the Mayflower Compact. It was an agreement by the Pilgrims while they were still on the Mayflower, which was the ship that brought the Pilgrims over when they settled in Massachusetts at Plymouth Rock. It also established the purpose of government, that the purpose of government was to create just and equal laws, and it's actually stated in the Mayflower Compact. And it says that government gets its power from the people. And all of this was done in the New Plymouth colony that the Pilgrims founded when they landed at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. The third example of representative government in colonial America were the New England town meetings. Of course, the Puritans were the ones who settled most of the New England colonies, and the way that you got to be able to vote was you had to be a Puritan and you had to be male. So it was mainly Puritan males that had a lot of power within these town meetings. So again, sort of limited as far as who was able to vote and who had power as far as in these early New England colonies. So again, these are three early examples of representative government in colonial America. The House of Burgesses of Virginia, the Mayflower Compact, and the New England town meetings. Make sure you understand those three. And a couple of events that are going to play major roles in leading to representative government, and this is mainly in Europe and in England, is going to be the English Civil War. This occurred in the 1600s, and because this Civil War was going on, England tended to leave the colonies alone because they were fighting amongst themselves. And so the English Civil Wars of the 1600s sort of allowed the colonies to sort of be on their own. The second important event that happens in England is the Glorious Revolution, which took place in 1688. This is where the King of England was removed bloodlessly, and you're going to get two figures that are going to take over, and that's going to be William and Mary. And the only way that they could gain power was by agreeing to a constitutional monarchy where they were going to share power with Parliament. And then the third thing would have been the ideas of the Enlightenment. Of course, the Enlightenment ideals are going to be things like reasoning, which we saw a lot of, and we're going to go into a little bit about the Enlightenment. But for the most part, the Enlightenment was really covered last year in your world history classes. So hopefully you remember some of these things. But the Enlightenment mainly dealt with a person's ability to reason. It talked a lot about rights. People are born with certain rights. It talked about liberty, and it talked about toleration. And of course, we've talked about religious toleration, and that was mainly where they were going during this period. But the Enlightenment ideals are definitely played a major role in the events that are going to lead to representative government. A key central figure in this time is going to be a guy named John Locke, who actually comes around during the Enlightenment. If you don't remember what the Enlightenment was, just to go back and sort of delve into some of the world history content, the Enlightenment occurs in the early 1600s, sort of towards the end of the Renaissance, right at the beginning of the early 1600s. But John Locke believed in the ideas of natural rights, and of course, we take some of his words and actually have used them in the Constitution, that all men are created equal, and every man has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we get those terms from John Locke. But going back to the Enlightenment was a period where we had this just explosion of knowledge, people investigating using science. We had political philosophies begin to change during that period, and John Locke played a major role. But natural rights was John Locke's main thing, and of course he said that everyone had the right to life, liberty, and property. He also made an argument for something known as the social contract, that the government gets its power from the people in return for protecting the people. And if the rulers violate those laws, that the people have the right to replace those rulers. So these were ideas of John Locke, And of course, he's going to lend a lot of his ideas to what would later be in the Declaration of Independence. And here's a sort of an idea of the social contract and who has power, who gets power, who protects whose rights, and so on. But again, John Locke, major figure during the Enlightenment, major figure and major influence in our Declaration of Independence and in the writings of Thomas Jefferson and some of the other founding fathers. So, one term that you've heard me mention earlier is something called salutary neglect. And salutary neglect was a policy where the colonies were left alone to sort of govern themselves. And Britain was not collecting any taxes. And this was mainly in the 1600s during that Civil War. By the mid 1700s, though, we're going to talk about an event in a minute, the French and Indian War, that's going to sort of change this idea of salutary neglect. So, in the during that period, though, Parliament's control over the colonies was limited by distance and by desire. They really didn't really mess with the colonies that much at all. And as long as the colonies did a couple of things, and one of them was that as long as they would import goods mainly from Great Britain and not from other European countries, then Great Britain was okay. And the other term that they gave was that they would export their goods to Great Britain and not to anyone else. They also allowed the colonial governments to have power to tax their citizens. So that was a big deal. But the ending of this policy of salutary neglect is going to be what's going to sort of spark and sort of fuel the American Revolution, because once the British come in and try to tax the colonies after sort of this salutary neglect period, the colonies aren't going to be, or the colonists aren't going to be very happy about what the British are trying to do to them. So I just mentioned a minute ago about the French and Indian War, and the French and Indian War is going to come about in the mid 1700s. Of course, this war is going to pit the British against the French. The French had the Indians as their allies. Therefore, the French and Indian War gets its name. The reason why the Indians are going to side with the French is because they felt like the French weren't trying to take their land, whereas the British were. And so the Indians, most of the Indian groups, sided with the French. Great Britain wanted a lot more control of North America and control of a lot more land is what's going to fuel this war. England is going to win, though. They're going to defeat France, and they're going to gain most of the land up to the Mississippi River. And then they were going to draw a line called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And what that line's going to do, and it's really sort of right where the Appalachian Mountains are, is that it was going to forbid colonial settlement past the Appalachian Mountains. But because of the French and Indian War and the cost of it that Britain had to put into it to fight the French, this is going to cause Great Britain to enforce taxes, and they're going to end salutary neglect. And once they do that, that's pretty much what's going to start this idea towards revolution. Again, here's a couple of maps you can look at, and you can see the Proclamation Line of 1763 here. And you can see the land that Britain gained. They gained pretty much all the land from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River because of the French and Indian War. We would later make a huge land purchase from France when Napoleon was their ruler. And we would gain most of the middle portion of America. So you can sort of get an idea about what it looked like during this period. So how are the British going to react once this war is over with, and how are they going to try to gain money and to try to recoup some of their losses due to this war? Well, the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to pass something called the Sugar Act in 1764. What the Sugar Act did was, it was, of course, a tax on sugar, but it was an indirect tax on imports, and it was used to raise money by regulating trade. So they tried to regulate trade and put a lot of taxes on whatever was coming into colonial America. The next one was the Stamp Act, and this was a direct tax on official documents. Things like marriage licenses, wills, and those types of things. all you had to pay a tax on them just to get married. So again, it was a big deal. The colonists resented this very, very much. But again, this is going to be repealed, and what it means to repeal something is to do away with it. It was repealed due to the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, who complained vigorously against it. A Stamp Act Congress was put into place to sort of argue against it. And then, of course, some of the colonists decided to boycott some of these products so they wouldn't have to pay this tax on official documents. One other act in reaction that the British would do was something called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were taxes on imports such as lead and glass, and of course, that was used a lot in colonial America. So, again, it impacted the colonies very, very much. We get the Tea Act in 1773, and most of us know this one with the Boston Tea Party. Great Britain has a monopoly on tea sales, and they decide to tax it because they're pretty much the only ones that are selling tea to the colony. So the colonies respond back by doing the Boston Tea Party. Some of the Sons of Liberty are going to dress up as Indians and dump tea into the Boston Harbor. The other act that was passed was something called the Intolerable Acts, and this was also known as the Coercive Acts. And this was used to punish the colonists. Ports were closed by the British government until they paid back the money for all the destroyed tea from the Boston Tea Party and other tea parties that were actually done. And more British soldiers were sent into the colony. So again, they were trying to show a show of force, which the colonists resented even more. But the colonists were not necessarily against the taxes. It was more the idea that the money that they were paying for the taxes was only going to Great Britain and not to the actual colonies themselves. So we're back to those learning objective questions. Again, you want to write these things down if you haven't already done so. And then you want to answer these, leave a little bit of room between each one. And then once you're done, you can bring those notes up to me and show them to me so I can sign off on them. Hopefully you got something out of this. If you got any questions when you get done with this, feel free to ask. And hopefully we'll be able to move on to the next one, which will be 1.3, and that's going to be the start of the American Revolution. Okay, I'll catch you guys on the next one.